Hey everyone, my name's Jessie, welcome back to my channel. Today let's talk about some fantasy books that I think are great for beginners. So today's video is episode 1 of a new series I'm doing called Ultimate Fantasy Recommendations. And basically I am trying to categorize every single fantasy book I've read into one of 4 categories. Either it's great for beginners, it's great for YA readers transitioning into adult, it's great for intermediate fantasy readers, or it's great for advanced fantasy readers. So those are the 4 episodes in this Ultimate Fantasy Recommendations series that I'm doing. And the big thing about these videos is I'm also going to be talking about books that I didn't personally love, but I would still love to recommend to fantasy readers in general. So these videos really are collectively like my ultimate fantasy book recommendations. Now I'm starting obviously with beginner fantasy. This one is for readers who are either just newer to reading in general, maybe you're not a huge reader and you haven't really read a whole lot since school or something like that, where you're just looking to get into reading again and fantasy for some reason really appeals to you. Or it's for folks who are currently really big readers but maybe haven't tried out the fantasy genre very much and are very intimidated by fantasy as an idea of a genre. One important note is all of these books are considered adult fantasy. I will be doing an entire YA fantasy recommendation video later on. This is all geared towards the adult age category. So I have quite a few recommendations today. I'm going to go ahead and stop talking and get right into it. The first book I have is called Ring Shout by P. Djeli Clark. This is a fantasy novella and it's more historical fantasy. The reason I think it would be great for beginners is because 1, it's a novella, so you're not committing yourself to a huge tome right away. You're kind of easing yourself into the fantasy genre. And 2, this is very much rooted in our world. It feels much more low fantasy, meaning it takes place in our world, but it has fantastical elements. And what this one follows is it follows a group of people in 1912 who are considered monster hunters. And the monsters they are hunting are called Ku Kluxes. And these are people who were previously in the Ku Klux Klan, had so much hatred in their heart that they allowed demons inside. And so these people have turned into monsters, and the main characters that you're following are all monster hunters. It is a fantastic novella that I love. Even though it is very short, it packs a huge emotional punch. I think the characterization in this book is fantastic, and just the idea of these Ku Kluxes is so fascinating. The horror elements that are in this book are also very creepy. It's very easy to visualize what's going on. So I do think it's a great book for beginners into the fantasy genre because it takes place in our world, has those fantastical elements, but you're not committing yourself to a huge book. Now, on the opposite side of the fantasy spectrum, we have a high fantasy recommendation, meaning this book takes place in a completely made-up world, and that is Theft of Swords by Michael J. Sullivan. This is the first book in the Ryaria Revelations series. This is actually the bind-up of the first 2 books in the series, and the reason I think that this is such a fantastic book for beginners into the fantasy genre is because the world building in this book is pretty simple, where it takes fantasy races that we are already very familiar with. It has elves, dwarves, and humans. That's about it. And that makes it pretty easy to follow the world building in general. And the focus of this series is really on this friendship between the 2 main characters, Hadrian and Royce, who are both fantastic characters to follow. They have a fantastic friendship that is so much fun to follow. I feel like this book also has a lot of humor that gives it more of this lighthearted tone, even when more serious things are going on. So for those reasons, I think that this is a great one for beginners, especially if you're looking to get more into high fantasy, into fantasy worlds that don't exist. This is a good one because you're not going to be bogged down with a lot of stuff that you aren't already familiar with. We all know elves, we all know dwarves, so this is a fantastic one to check out. The next one, of course, is going to be Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson, starting with The Final Empire. This is a trilogy of books, and I had to put one Brandon Sanderson book on this list, and it was kind of hard to pick out which series to go with in this particular list. And the reason I landed on Mistborn is because I think that for beginners into the fantasy genre, this is a really good one because it kind of holds your hand in explaining a lot of the world and magic to you. It doesn't kind of make you sit and figure it out. The main character in this story is kind of coming to grips with her own magic and is learning about her own magic. And so you're learning the magic with her, and it's told in a very easy to follow way. And Brandon Sanderson's writing style is pretty well known for being a little bit more straightforward. It's not very flowery, it's very easy to read, so it's not this dense writing style that you're going to get bogged down in descriptions with. I think he has a writing style that's very easy to read. It also just has a fantastic heist plot that is so much fun to follow. It has amazing character work and this great found family aspect. It's got a huge twisty type ending that is a lot of fun to try and figure out. So I think that this has a lot of great things about fantasy all packed into this one trilogy. And I do think it's written in a way that makes it very easy for beginners to the genre to really absorb what's going on. So highly recommend this one for beginners. The next book I have for beginners is Vicious by V.E. Schwab. The reason I'm putting this one on the beginner list is because it's more of an urban, low fantasy where it takes place not necessarily in our world, but what feels very much like our world. We are in a city, it's a very urban setting, our main characters are in college working on a thesis. The fantastical elements that are introduced in this book is actually dealing with people with extraordinary abilities, or like superhuman abilities that give them these powers from having near-death experiences. So it takes this whole idea of superpowers and puts this really cool twist on it. And I think that if you like those more like comic book type stories, like if you're a big Marvel fan, if you like comic books in general or superheroes in any way, I think that this one's really going to appeal to you because it plays with a lot of those ideas, and that's really what the fantastical elements are in this. Beyond that, it feels like it's very much in our world. And I think that the character work in this one is some of the best. I absolutely love the characters in this book. They're very morally gray, where you're not sure who's the bad guy, who's the good guy. You're not sure if you're really supposed to be rooting for any of them, and I love that kind of stuff. So if that appeals to you, I definitely recommend checking out Vicious. The next book I have is probably one that's very well known to a lot of people already, but I have to call it out anyway because I've read it and it has to go on one of these lists, and that is A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. So this one is now correctly shelved as adult, and the reason I'm putting it on this list is because it's much more of a fantasy romance series than anything else. I do think it leans heavier into romance than any of these other books that are on this list. So if you really like romance, this is a good one to dip into fantasy with because it starts out as this Beauty and the Beast retelling and really then takes its own direction with it. You're following a character who is coming from a human world and going into this fairy fae world, and so you're kind of learning the world with her. It's not a very complex world, it's pretty easy to understand, and really at the core of this, it's a romance story. It's definitely more about her relationships with the other characters rather than building out the world and the magic and all that. So if that's really the focus you're looking for, you really love romance and you want to check out something that's maybe more of a fantasy romance, this truly is, I think, the best place to start with that. The next book I have is Mort by Terry Pratchett. So this is the first book in the Discworld Death Collection, and the reason I have this for beginners is because I think that the writing style and the characterization in this book can really be appreciated by anyone. If you love things like Monty Python and the Holy Grail, you are going to really appreciate what Terry Pratchett is doing in this series. I think that his humor is just perfect for a lot of people, including myself. I love Terry Pratchett's humor in these books, and his world building is very abstract in a lot of ways, where even a very seasoned fantasy reader is not really going to grasp like every concept that's going on in these books. And that's really not what this is necessarily about. I think if you're really going to love this series, you're going to love it because of Terry Pratchett's humor, his writing, and the characters he creates in these stories. At least for the Death Collection, that's been my experience with it. And I haven't read any other Discworld yet, and I'm definitely planning on it. But I do think that this is a great one for beginners because I think these shorter books are a little less intimidating for beginners to the genre, but it's also just a lot of fun, very lighthearted, and filled with humor and great characters. The next book I have to talk about is one that is extremely popular in the fantasy community right now, and that is Jade City by Fonda Leigh. So this is a fantastic book for beginners into fantasy because, again, it feels like it could take place in our world with a little bit of magic sprinkled in. This book at the core is a family drama and is a mafia drama book. It is really focused on characters, the relationships between these characters, the messy family drama in it, and some of these mafia politics. The fantasy elements that are introduced are very minor. The idea behind this series is that Jade gives people certain powers if they ingest it, and Jade is what the mafia clans are looking to control. So that's really the extent of the fantasy in this book, is the idea of Jade and the idea that it can give people powers. But beyond that, at its core, it's much more of a family drama than anything else. And I think if you're a huge fan of things like Succession or Peaky Blinders, you will see hints of those types of stories and tones all throughout Jade City. I think that this is perfect for fans of those TV shows. So I highly recommend this one to any reader. Even if you've never picked up a fantasy book before, I would easily hand this book to anyone and highly recommend it, especially for character-driven readers. The next book I have is Hood by Stephen R. Lawhead. So the reason I have this one on the list is, one, it's a Robin Hood retelling, and I think a lot of us are familiar already with the Robin Hood legend. So that already gives you a sense of what to expect from this story. But two, this feels much more historical fiction than fantasy. The fantasy elements are that it's a retelling of the Robin Hood legend, but it very much takes place in our world and feels like it could have been real history. So if you love really cool historical fantasies or retellings, this is a great one. I also think it has some of the best villain work that I've read. Like, the villains of this story are so heinous, and you just can't stand them. And it's so well done. So well done. So I highly recommend this one because it's got great pacing, it's got really good politicking, and it was just a lot of fun to discover this author's take on the Robin Hood legend. The next one I have is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. So this one I was debating whether or not to put it for beginners because I do think that this one has some really dark elements to it. But the reason at the end of the day I put it on the beginner list is because I do think that the fact that it is based on a real historical event, if you didn't know, this book is following Sino-Japanese War and is kind of highlighting a very specific event during that war in this book, referred to as the Rape of Nanjing. And if you don't know anything about that history, I highly recommend going into this one. Even if you do know a lot about that history, I highly recommend this because it teaches you a lot about some real world history through this fantasy lens, and I think it does it in a really fantastically executed way. You have a very morally gray main character in this book who is very much coming of age almost in this story. She starts off kind of going through this military school and is quickly thrust into a war that she realizes she may not be as prepared for as she thought she was. And at the end of the day, this is really examining the consequences of war and how it affects affects the people fighting the war. The fantasy elements of this one kind of take the idea of opium and allowing certain characters to access the gods through ingesting opium, and it's really fascinating magic because it's again based off of real world drugs that were very prevalent during this time and still are. And this is very much rooted in real history, but just takes this fantasy twist on it, and I think it does it really well. On a much lighter note, the next book I have, if you're not looking for something quite so heavy, I have The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This is a very popular one in the fantasy community, but even beyond the fantasy community, and that's why I think it's great for beginners, because this book really at its core is a story about acceptance and love. It follows this social worker who is assigned this orphanage that is housing these children that are different types of creatures who are outcasted from society. And the social worker kind of comes to learn more about himself through these amazing characters. It's just a beautiful, warm hug of a story. It is so heartwarming and so sweet, and the children in this story are really what make it so special. So if you love a good heartwarming story, then I highly recommend this one. The fantasy elements in it are very minor. Again, I think it's considered fantasy because of the fantastical creatures that some of the children are, but beyond that, it definitely feels like this could just take place in our world. So I loved this. I can't recommend it enough. Just open it up if you ever need to smile. The next one I have is Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. This one is a very, very dark fantasy that I think is very light on the fantasy elements. It is much more of a paranormal type fantasy where you have ghosts and dark magic. It takes place at Yale, and you are essentially following a character who gets caught up in Yale's secret societies and some of the dark, twisted magic that those societies are doing and performing. And it gets really heavy, so make sure to check for content warnings before you go into this one. Highly recommend it for fans of very atmospheric reads, maybe more of those dark academia reads. It's not one that was my absolute favorite, but I did appreciate a lot of the atmosphere that Leigh Bardugo incorporated in this one. And the character of Alex Stern, I've seen a lot of people connect to and really love. So this one may totally work for you if you love that idea of exploring the darker side of the Ivy League elite. I have 3 more for you that I don't physically own anymore because they weren't personally for me, but I still wanted to mention them because a lot of people still love them. The first one is A Natural History of Dragons by Marie Brennan. This one is a really unique memoir style fantasy story that follows a woman named Lady Trent, and you are essentially reading as if she wrote a memoir of her life. And she basically studies dragons, and you are following her adventures as she tries to discover more about dragons. And the reason I think it's good for beginners is because I think it has a writing style that's very unique, witty, quirky, is going to work for a lot of people. The main character of Lady Trent, I can see a lot of people loving, but it also doesn't have this huge expansive fantasy world. It does feel very cozy in that you're very much following just Lady Trent's story and her adventures, and it feels very low stakes where she's just trying to discover more about dragons, and she gets into some shenanigans along the way, but at the end of the day, like, we all know what dragons are, so there's not a whole lot to unpack here. It's a pretty straightforward story, and if you like that memoir style format, I think it could really, really work for you. The next one I have is The City We Became by N.K. Jemisin. Even though this one didn't personally work for me, I've seen a lot of people love it. It's very much an urban fantasy where it takes New York City and plays with the idea of if the boroughs of New York City each were personified into their own separate human being. So you have a cast of characters who all represent a different borough of New York City, and they are essentially trying to battle this city-eating monster. I think what this book really does well is it really creates this amazing atmosphere of New York City. It felt very much like a love letter to the city. So if you are a fan of New York City, or you've been there or lived there or really appreciate that city atmosphere, I think that this one could really work for you. It also deals with a lot of social themes. So if that's something you really like to explore and dive deeper into, I think that this is a really good one to go to. Even if it didn't work for me, I can definitely see the appeal of it and see why a lot of other people loved it. The last one I have that wasn't my personal favorite, but a lot of people absolutely love it. It is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This one is, I think, very, very low fantasy. It deals with these magicians and this magical night circus that magically appears in different places each night, and you're dealing with two competing magicians who end up having this kind of budding romance. It's a very forbidden romance, and this book, what it really focuses on and does exceptionally well is setting the scene and the atmosphere, building this very magical feeling inside of you as you're reading it. You can really sense the magic of this circus and these characters. I think that it's written beautifully. Where it didn't focus quite as much was on the actual plot, and the characters themselves, I felt, weren't as developed as I personally love. But if you are more of a literary reader who just loves to dissect the words on the page and really get lost in these magical atmospheres, I think that this one could really work for you. It is beautifully told. So The Night Circus is another one that I really wanted to mention that's great for beginners. So those are all of the fantasy books that I think are amazing for beginner readers. Did you see any that you've read, and what did you think of them? And then do you have another recommendation that I didn't mention? I have not read all the fantasy books, so I'm sure that there are some that I definitely need to read myself that hopefully you can comment down below and recommend to others. So if you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you'd like to, and I will see you all in my next one. Bye.